What would you do if the last promise your child made, to return home safe, was broken forever? For Sarah Hartwell, that promise came on a crisp June morning in 2015, when her 17-year-old daughter Chloe stood at the kitchen counter, methodically packing energy bars into her hiking backpack. The sunlight streaming through their Boulder home cast everything in golden hues. Chloe's auburn hair, the map spread across the granite countertop, the gentle smile that had been lighting up their house for years. "We'll be back by sunset, Mom," Chloe had said, reaching over to hug her mother. "I promise." Those would be the last words Sarah ever heard her daughter speak. Chloe Hartwell was everything a parent could hope for. Honor roll student, environmental club president, the kind of teenager who still held her mother's hand at movies. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where her life was headed. Northwestern University had already accepted her with a full scholarship, and her future stretched ahead of her like an open road. But Chloe's heart belonged to 18-year-old Jake Morrison, the boy who'd been her constant companion for 2 years. Jake was lean and athletic, with dark hair that never quite behaved and green eyes that sparkled with adventure. He'd just graduated as valedictorian and planned to study environmental science at Colorado State. They were young lovers in the truest sense, inseparable, devoted, planning a future that seemed as bright as that June morning. The couple had been hiking together since sophomore year, earning reputations as careful, experienced outdoors enthusiasts. They knew the Rocky Mountain trails like their own neighborhood streets, always carried proper gear, always told their parents exactly where they were going. That morning, they planned to hike the Emerald Lake Trail, a moderate 5-mile round trip they'd completed dozens of times before. Chloe had traced the route on her topographical map with a yellow highlighter, marking rest stops and photo opportunities. Jake loaded fresh batteries into his camera, excited to capture the wildflowers that would be blooming in the high meadows. Tom Morrison, Jake's father, watched his son load hiking boots into their Honda Civic with a mixture of pride and the subtle anxiety that comes with loving someone deeply. "Got your compass? First aid kit? Extra water?" "Dad, we've got everything," Jake laughed, but he double-checked his pack anyway because he knew it would ease his father's mind. "We'll be fine. It's just the Emerald Lake Trail." The last photo ever taken of Chloe and Jake showed them standing beside Jake's car in the trailhead parking lot, arms around each other's waists, both grinning at the camera Jake held at arm's length. Chloe wore her lucky navy hiking jacket and carried her well-worn Keldy backpack. Jake had his camera bag slung across his chest and wore the Colorado State University t-shirt Chloe had given him for his birthday. They looked young, happy, utterly certain that this was just another perfect day in their perfect young lives. But just 24 hours later, that promise Chloe had made her mother was already broken. The sunset came and went without any sign of the teenagers. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages disappeared into the void of poor mountain cell service. When search and rescue teams reached their car the next morning, still sitting alone in the parking lot, with dew covering the windshield, Sarah Hartwell's world began to collapse. Because what no one knew yet was that Chloe and Jake had never made it to Emerald Lake. They had never seen the wildflowers Jake wanted to photograph or reached the scenic overlook Chloe had marked on her map. Instead, somewhere on that familiar trail they'd hiked so many times before, something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. The Colorado backcountry where Chloe and Jake vanished is a landscape of breathtaking beauty and hidden dangers. Towering peaks that scrape the sky give way to dense forests of pine and aspen, where wildlife corridors wind through terrain that can shift from gentle meadow to deadly cliff face in a matter of steps. This is wilderness in its purest form. Over 1 million acres where cell phones fall silent, where weather can change from sunny to deadly in minutes, where a single wrong turn can mean the difference between a perfect day and a fight for survival. Chloe and Jake knew these mountains as well as any teenagers could. They'd been hiking together since Chloe was 15, starting with easy day hikes and gradually building up to overnight camping trips. They'd learned to read weather patterns, to recognize dangerous terrain, to respect the wilderness that had become their sanctuary. Their preparation that June morning was methodical, born from years of experience. Chloe spread her gear across her bedroom floor like a surgeon laying out instruments. Water purification tablets, compass, whistle, emergency blanket, first aid supplies. She'd learned early that the mountains forgave many mistakes, but never carelessness. Jake's preparation was equally thorough. He checked and double-checked his camera equipment. Knowing that the high meadows would be perfect for the nature photography portfolio, he planned to submit with his college applications. His backpack contained enough food and water for a full day, plus emergency supplies in case they decided to extend their hike. "You sure about this trail?" Chloe's mother asked for the third time, as Chloe loaded her pack into Jake's car. Sarah Hartwell had been an avid hiker herself before marriage, and motherhood claimed most of her free time. She understood her daughter's love for the mountains, but she also understood their dangers. "Mom, it's the Emerald Lake Trail," Chloe replied patiently. "We could do it blindfolded. 5 miles round trip, well marked the whole way. We'll be back by dinner." Tom Morrison felt the same protective anxiety as he watched his son prepare for the hike. Jake had always been responsible, careful, the kind of kid who researched everything before attempting it. But the mountains didn't care about preparation or good intentions. They only cared about respect. "Weather's supposed to be perfect all day," Jake said, checking his phone one last time before losing service. "Clear skies, temperature in the 70s. Couldn't ask for better conditions." As their car disappeared down the winding mountain road, both sets of parents returned to their Saturday morning routines. Sarah Hartwell tended her garden, occasionally glancing up at the peaks visible from her backyard. Tom Morrison went to his office to catch up on paperwork, but found himself staring out the window toward the mountains where his son was hiking. Neither parent could shake the subtle unease that seemed to hang in the air that morning. Later, they would both describe it as a feeling that something was wrong, though they couldn't explain why. The Emerald Lake Trailhead sits at 8,500 feet above sea level, surrounded by parking for perhaps 30 vehicles. On busy summer weekends, the lot fills with cars bearing license plates from across the country. Families seeking adventure, couples celebrating anniversaries, solo hikers pursuing solitude. That June morning, only a handful of vehicles occupied the gravel spaces. Chloe and Jake's Honda Civic settled into a spot near the trailhead marker, joining a weathered pickup truck and a silver SUV with Colorado plates. Chloe shouldered her pack and breathed deeply of the thin mountain air. At this elevation, every breath carried the sharp scent of pine and the promise of adventure. Jake adjusted his camera strap and checked his GPS one final time, marking their starting coordinates. The trail began innocently enough, a well-maintained dirt path winding through stands of lodgepole pine. Wooden markers every quarter-mile showed distances to various destinations. Emerald Lake, 2.5 miles, Sky Pond, 3.8 miles, the Continental Divide, 12 miles. Chloe took the lead, setting a steady pace that would carry them to their destination without exhaustion. Behind her, Jake paused frequently to photograph interesting rock formations, wildflowers, and the way morning light filtered through the forest canopy. They were young, healthy, experienced hikers on a familiar trail under perfect conditions. Everything that could go right was going right. But when investigators later traced their steps, what they found at the campsite would only deepen the mystery of what happened to Colorado's missing teenage lovers. 3 days after Chloe and Jake failed to return home, Colorado Parks and Wildlife Ranger Patricia Santos pushed through thick underbrush 2 miles off the Emerald Lake Trail, following coordinates provided by search and rescue teams who'd been scouring the wilderness with helicopters and tracking dogs. What she found defied every theory about what might have happened to the missing teenagers. The campsite sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, invisible from any established trail. Someone had taken considerable care to choose this location. It was sheltered from wind, near a small stream for water, with enough flat ground to accommodate 2 tents. And those tents were exactly what made Ranger Santos stop dead in her tracks. Both tents were perfectly erected, guy lines properly tensioned, rain flies correctly positioned. The zippers were closed, but not locked. Inside, Sleeping bags were laid out with the precision of a military inspection, corners squared, surfaces smooth, as if someone had just finished making beds in a luxury hotel. Chloe's bright blue REI tint contained her sleeping bag, pillow, and personal items arranged with careful attention to detail. Her toiletries sat in a neat row beside her pack: toothbrush, biodegradable soap, feminine hygiene products. Her clothes were folded and stacked, as if she'd been planning to wear them the next morning. Jake's tent told the same impossible story. His camera equipment was safely stowed in protective cases, batteries removed and stored separately to prevent corrosion. His journal lay open to an entry dated the day they disappeared, describing their excitement about exploring new photography locations. But the most unnerving discovery was the food. A bear canister, the type required in this wilderness area to protect supplies from wildlife, sat unopened beside a carefully constructed fire ring. Inside, neatly packed meals for 3 days remained untouched. Freeze-dried camping food, energy bars, trail mix, even chocolate that hadn't melted in the summer heat. Ranger Santos walked the perimeter of the campsite 3 times, looking for any sign of disturbance. She'd investigated missing persons cases before, and she knew what to look for. Signs of struggle would leave disturbed earth, broken branches, scattered belongings. Wild animal attacks would leave blood, torn fabric, drag marks. This campsite showed none of those signs. "It's like they just stepped out for a walk and never came back," she reported to the search coordinator by radio. "Everything's here except them." The eerie perfection of the scene sent chills down the spines of experienced search and rescue volunteers who'd seen every kind of wilderness emergency. Hypothermia victims were found in their sleeping bags. Lost hikers left trails of dropped gear as they became disoriented. Accident victims left evidence of their final moments. But Chloe and Jake had vanished from a campsite that looked like it was waiting for their return. Dr. Michael Torres, a forensic specialist called in to analyze the scene, spent hours photographing every detail. The fire ring contained cold ashes from a properly built and safely extinguished fire. Nearby, a water purification system sat unused. The teenagers had brought enough treated water for their planned trip. "In 20 years of investigating missing persons cases, I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Torres told reporters. "There's no sign of struggle, no indication they left in a hurry, no evidence of outside interference. It's as if they simply walked into the forest and vanished." The discovery launched new theories about what might have happened to Chloe and Jake. Had they staged their own disappearance? Were they running away together, perhaps eloping or trying to avoid some unknown pressure at home? But those theories crumbled under investigation. Their bank accounts remained untouched. Chloe's acceptance to Northwestern University represented her life's dream. She'd never abandon it. Jake was planning to propose to Chloe after graduation. Friends later revealed he'd already purchased a promise ring he intended to give her on her hiking trip. More disturbing theories emerged from the depths of internet forums and true crime communities. Had they encountered someone dangerous in the wilderness? A poacher, perhaps, or a survivalist living off the grid? Had they witnessed something they weren't supposed to see? Local law enforcement interviewed every person known to have been in the area during the time frame when Chloe and Jake disappeared. Day hikers, overnight campers, park employees, wildlife researchers, dozens of people who might have seen or heard something unusual. All of those interviews led nowhere. But the most chilling part of the campsite discovery wasn't what investigators found. It was what they didn't find. No personal electronics, despite both teenagers carrying phones and Jake's love of digital photography. No identification, despite both carrying wallets and driver's licenses. It was as if someone had carefully removed every trace of Chloe and Jake's identities while leaving their belongings untouched. As news of the mysterious campsite spread, it captured national attention. Cable news programs featured experts debating theories. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Social media buzzed with amateur investigators proposing increasingly elaborate explanations. But for Sarah Hartwell and Tom Morrison, the media attention felt like salt in an open wound. Their children were missing, possibly dead, and the world was treating their tragedy like entertainment. The search efforts continued through the summer and into fall, gradually scaling back as hope faded. Chloe and Jake had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions that no one could answer. Years passed. The media moved on to other stories, but the families never gave up hope. And then, 5 years after that perfect campsite was discovered, a hunter deep in the Colorado forest stumbled on something that would change everything. 5 years. 1,826 days of not knowing, of hoping, of watching every news report about missing persons cases with desperate attention, praying for a breakthrough that never came. For Sarah Hartwell, those years transformed her from a suburban mother content with her quiet life into a relentless advocate who would not let her daughter be forgotten. She learned to navigate police bureaucracies, coordinate volunteer search efforts, and manage social media campaigns with the desperation of someone for whom giving up wasn't an option. Her kitchen table became a command center covered with topographical maps marked with colored pins, red for areas already searched, yellow for promising leads that led nowhere, blue for locations where credible sightings had been reported. She traced so many possible routes with her finger that the plastic coating on the maps began to wear thin. Tom Morrison threw himself into the search with equal intensity, using his engineering background to organize systematic grid searches of wilderness areas. He purchased thermal imaging drones, learning to pilot them himself when the budget couldn't accommodate professional operators. Weekend after weekend, he led volunteer teams through increasingly remote terrain, always hoping this would be the day they'd find some trace of Jake and Chloe. The first year brought dozens of volunteers for weekend searches. Local hiking clubs, church groups, Chloe's classmates, Jake's teachers, good people willing to spend their Saturday mornings trudging through difficult terrain on the slim chance they might spot something professional search teams had missed. But as months stretched into years, the volunteer numbers dwindled. People had their own lives, their own problems. The missing teenagers became old news, a sad story people remembered when their names came up, but no longer felt compelled to act upon. The second year brought a series of false leads that felt like emotional torture. A hiker in Montana reported seeing a young couple matching Chloe and Jake's description at a remote campground. The teenagers turned out to be college students from Oregon who resembled the missing pair only in age and hair color. A truck driver claimed he'd seen Chloe at a gas station in Nevada, traveling with an older man who wouldn't let her speak. Investigation revealed that Chloe was a runaway from California who bore only passing resemblance to the missing girl. Each false lead sent Sarah Hartwell's heart racing with hope, followed by crushing disappointment when the truth emerged. But she chased every single one, driving hundreds of miles on tips that usually proved worthless within hours of arrival. The third year marked a turning point. Media interest faded to occasional anniversary stories that rehashed the same basic facts without adding new information. Police investigators, while still officially keeping the case open, moved on to more recent disappearances with fresher evidence trails. That was when Sarah and Tom made a decision that would consume their lives completely. They would not wait for others to find their children. They would become investigators themselves. Sarah learned to read police reports, understand forensic terminology, and analyze witness statements with the intensity of a detective. She built relationships with journalists, private investigators, and other families of missing persons, creating a network of people who understood the unique hell of not knowing. Tom focused on technology and logistics. He studied search and rescue methodologies, learned to operate sophisticated GPS equipment, and created detailed databases of every piece of information related to the case. His garage filled with camping gear, communication equipment, and boxes of flyers bearing his son's photograph. The fourth year brought their first major breakthrough. Not answers, but hope. A forensic genealogist working cold cases agreed to take on Chloe and Jake's disappearance pro bono, using new DNA techniques to analyze trace evidence collected from their campsite years earlier. The testing revealed something investigators had missed: microscopic traces of an unknown person's DNA mixed with samples from Chloe's tent. Not enough to identify the person, but enough to prove that someone else had been at that campsite. Someone whose presence had never been explained. This discovery reinvigorated the official investigation. Detective Linda Rodriguez, newly assigned to the cold case unit, approached the evidence with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques unavailable in 2015. We're not looking at this as a missing persons case anymore, Detective Rodriguez announced at a press conference that winter. We're investigating this as a potential homicide. The word homicide hit both families like a physical blow. After years of hoping Chloe and Jake were alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or held against their will, but still breathing, the official acknowledgement that they were likely dead felt like losing them all over again, but also brought new resources. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created profiles of possible suspects. Cold case investigators from other jurisdictions shared information about similar disappearances. A $50,000 award fund, raised through community donations, offered hope that someone with information might finally come forward. The fifth year passed quietly, marked only by vigils and anniversary remembrances. Sarah and Tom continued their weekly searches, now covering areas hundreds of miles from where their children had vanished, following theories about trafficking routes and disposal sites that kept them awake at night. Chloe would have been 22 that year, finishing college, perhaps planning a wedding or starting a career. Jake would have been 23, maybe working as an environmental scientist, fighting to protect the wilderness where he'd disappeared. Instead, their faces stared out from missing persons posters that had faded and weathered on telephone poles and community bulletin boards across Colorado. But then, on a crisp October morning 5 years after Chloe and Jake vanished, retired construction worker Bill Henderson was walking his dog through dense forest near the Continental Divide when his German Shepherd, Max, began behaving strangely. Max kept circling back to a particular spot, whining and pawing at the ground beneath a fallen pine tree. Bill had owned German Shepherds for 30 years, and he recognized the behavior. Max had found something dead. What Bill Henderson discovered buried beneath the soil that morning would finally begin to answer questions that had tormented two families for half a decade. But it would also raise new questions more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Bill Henderson had been hiking these mountains since he was a boy, first with his father and brothers, then alone as an adult seeking solitude after difficult days at construction sites around Denver. At 68, with arthritic knees and a heart condition that limited his range, he stuck to familiar trails that wouldn't challenge his aging body too severely. But Max, his 3-year-old German Shepherd, had other ideas that October morning. They'd been following the old mining road that parallels Willow Creek, a route Bill had walked hundreds of times over the decades. Max usually trotted ahead, investigating interesting scents before returning to check on his slower human companion. The dog was well-trained, reliable, the kind of hiking partner who enhanced the wilderness experience rather than creating complications. That's why Bill paid attention when Max's behavior changed. The dog kept circling back to a spot about 50 feet off the main path, where a massive pine tree had fallen years earlier, creating a natural windbreak that had become overgrown with thick underbrush. Max would approach the area, emit a low whine, paw at the ground, then look back at Bill with the intense stare that meant, "You need to see this." "What is it, boy?" Bill called out, but Max just continued his anxious circling. Bill pushed through the tangled branches and undergrowth, following his dog's lead. The fallen tree had created a small clearing, sheltered and hidden from casual view. Decades of accumulated pine needles and decomposing leaves had created a thick carpet of organic material. And there, where Max kept pawing, something didn't look right. The ground showed signs of old disturbance, not natural settling, but deliberate excavation that had been carefully concealed. Someone had dug here, then worked hard to make it look undisturbed. But time and weather had revealed subtle differences in how the soil had settled. Bill Henderson had seen enough construction sites to recognize when earth had been moved and replaced. His trained eye could spot the kind of settling patterns that indicated buried utilities, foundation work, or his mind shied away from the thought. He pulled out his cell phone, grateful for the rare spot of service, and dialed 911. "I think I found something," he told the dispatcher. "Something that's been buried. You need to send someone out here." Within hours, the quiet forest clearing was transformed into a crime scene. Sheriff's deputies secured the perimeter while forensic specialists began the careful process of excavating what Bill Henderson and Max had discovered. Detective Rodriguez arrived as the afternoon sun began slanting through the trees, casting long shadows across the makeshift archaeological site. She'd been hoping for a break in the Chloe and Jake case, but she'd also learned not to get her hopes up too high. False alarms were common in missing persons investigations. Animal bones, old Native American artifacts, even discarded mannequins had generated emergency calls over the years. But this felt different. The excavation team worked with brushes and small tools, treating the site like the archaeological dig it had essentially become. Each scoop of soil was sifted, each artifact photographed and cataloged before removal. The first significant find came just before sunset, a fragment of fabric, blue and weathered but clearly artificial. The kind of high-tech material used in outdoor gear. Chloe had been wearing a blue hiking jacket the day she disappeared. Detective Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain professional. Hundreds of hikers use this area every year. Blue outdoor clothing was common. The fabric could belong to anyone. Then came the second find. About 18 inches down, partially wrapped in what appeared to be a plastic tarp, the excavation team uncovered unmistakably human remains. Not a complete skeleton. Time and weather and forest scavengers had scattered and damaged the bones, but enough to confirm that Bill Henderson had stumbled onto something far more significant than anyone had dared hope. The remains were carefully extracted and transported to the State Forensics Laboratory in Denver. Dr. Sarah Kim, Colorado's chief medical examiner, took personal charge of the analysis, knowing that two families had been waiting years for answers. DNA testing would take several days, but initial examination provided tentative identification. The size and structure of the bones suggested a young adult, probably female, consistent with someone Chloe's age and build. Sarah Hartwell received a call on a Tuesday evening while she was preparing dinner. Detective Rodriguez's voice was gentle but direct. "Mrs. Hartwell, we've found remains that we believe may be Chloe's. I need you to know that we won't have definitive confirmation for several more days, but the preliminary evidence is very strong." The phone slipped from Sarah's hands, clattering onto the kitchen floor as 5 years of desperate hope collapsed into devastating certainty. She'd known, somewhere deep in her mother's heart, that Chloe was gone. But knowing and knowing are different things entirely. Tom Morrison received a similar call minutes later. Unlike Sarah, who collapsed with grief, Tom felt a strange sense of relief mixed with his sorrow. The not knowing had been torture. Answers, even terrible answers, felt like a form of mercy. But the forensic analysis would reveal details that transformed their grief into something darker and more complex. The remains showed signs of trauma, not the kind of damage that comes from falls or animal attacks or exposure to the elements. The kind of damage that comes from human violence. Chloe Hartwell had been murdered. But where was Jake? And what could explain the strange, untouched campsite that had puzzled investigators for 5 years? The answers buried beneath that forest floor would prove more disturbing than anyone was prepared to discover. Dr. Sarah Kim had performed thousands of autopsies during her 20-year career as Colorado's chief medical examiner, but she'd never examined remains that had been buried for 5 years in wilderness conditions. The case required techniques more commonly used by archaeologists than medical examiners: careful reconstruction, patient analysis, and the ability to read stories written in bone and decay. Chloe's remains told a story that chilled everyone involved in the investigation. The skeleton was incomplete. Forest scavengers had scattered smaller bones, and Colorado's harsh freeze-thaw cycles had damaged others. But what remained painted a clear picture of Chloe Hartwell's final moments, and it wasn't the picture anyone had expected. The victim suffered blunt force trauma to the skull. Dr. Kim reported to Detective Rodriguez during a briefing that would haunt both women for years. Multiple impact points suggest a sustained attack rather than a single blow. This wasn't an accident. Chloe had been beaten to death. The revelation that their daughter had died violently, in terror and pain, shattered what remained of Sarah Hartwell's composure. She'd spent 5 years imagining every possible fate for Chloe: kidnapping, human trafficking, amnesia, even voluntary disappearance. But she'd never truly accepted that someone had deliberately killed her child. Tom Morrison's reaction was different, but equally intense. The gentle man who'd spent years organizing search parties and coordinating with volunteers began talking about justice, about finding whoever had done this, about making them pay. Friends worried that his grief was transforming into something darker and more dangerous. But Dr. Kim's analysis revealed more mysteries than it solved. The plastic tarp that had partially wrapped Chloe's remains was industrial grade, not the kind of material typically found in camping supplies. Chemical analysis suggested it had been manufactured within 2 years of Chloe's death. Someone had come prepared for disposal, not just violence. More disturbing was what the bones didn't show. In cases of wilderness violence, attacks by strangers, confrontations with poachers or survivalists, victims typically showed defensive wounds, signs they'd fought back or tried to flee. Chloe's remains showed no such evidence. It's as if she was taken by surprise, Dr. Kim explained to the investigation team. Or she knew and trusted her attacker. The implications sent shockwaves through both families and the broader community. Chloe and Jake weren't random victims of wilderness crime. They'd been targeted by someone they knew, someone who'd gained their trust long enough to get close. But the forensic analysis raised another question that would consume investigators for months. Where was Jake? The excavation site where Bill Henderson had made his discovery was thoroughly searched. Ground-penetrating radar swept the area for additional graves. Cadaver dogs worked grid patterns through the surrounding forest. Forensic archaeologists expanded their dig site, looking for any trace of the missing young man. They found nothing. Jake Morrison had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. No remains, no personal effects, no trace of DNA anywhere near Chloe's burial site. For the first time since the teenagers had disappeared, investigators began considering the possibility that their fates had been different. Had Jake been taken somewhere else? Was he buried in a location far from Chloe's grave? Or the possibility that kept his father awake at night: was Jake somehow still alive? Detective Rodriguez assembled a task force that included FBI behavioral analysts, forensic specialists, and investigators from other jurisdictions where similar crimes had occurred. The Chloe Hartwell murder, as it was now officially designated, had become a high-priority case with resources to match its complexity. The behavioral analyst created a profile of the likely perpetrator, someone familiar with wilderness areas, comfortable with outdoor activities, probably male, with local knowledge of the terrain where Chloe's body was found. Someone organized enough to plan disposal carefully, but impulsive enough to commit murder in a moment of rage or panic. Most significantly, someone who knew both teenagers well enough to lure them away from their planned hiking route. This last detail haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Chloe and Jake weren't naive city kids who might trust a stranger offering help. They were experienced hikers who knew wilderness safety protocols. Getting them to abandon their planned route and follow someone to a remote location would have required considerable trust. The investigation focused on people in the teenagers' lives who fit the behavioral profile. Teachers, coaches, family friends, employees at outdoor gear stores they'd frequented. Anyone who might have had access to their hiking plans, knowledge of their routines, and the outdoor experience to commit and conceal murder in wilderness conditions. But every lead reached dead ends. Chloe and Jake's social circle was small and tight-knit. Their teachers remembered them fondly. Their employers gave them glowing recommendations. Their friends described them as careful, responsible, unlikely to take risks or trust strangers. The investigation expanded to include registered sex offenders in the area, people with histories of violence, anyone who might have been using the wilderness to hide from law enforcement or society. Again, nothing substantial emerged. As winter settled over Colorado, Detective Rodriguez found herself staring at evidence boards covered with photographs, timelines, and maps that told a story without an ending. Chloe Hartwell had been murdered by someone she knew and trusted. That person had buried her carefully in a remote location, then vanished without leaving any trace of themselves or Jake Morrison. It was as if the killer had simply walked into the wilderness and disappeared, taking Jake's body, or Jake himself, with them into oblivion. But forensic science had one more secret to reveal, one more piece of evidence that would send the investigation in a direction no one had anticipated. Hidden beneath Chloe's remains, wrapped in the same industrial plastic but separated by careful layers of soil, investigators found something that changed everything they thought they knew about the case. The discovery came 3 days after Christmas, during what was supposed to be the final sweep of Bill Henderson's excavation site. Colorado's early winter had frozen the ground, making digging difficult, and the investigation team was preparing to suspend work until spring thaw made further excavation possible. Detective Rodriguez had authorized one last ground-penetrating radar sweep, more for completeness than any real expectation of additional finds. The technology had already mapped the area where Chloe's remains were found, revealing the disturbed soil patterns that confirmed deliberate burial. But the radar operator, a specialist borrowed from the Colorado Department of Transportation, noticed something odd about the readings from a spot about 12 feet south of Chloe's grave. "There's another anomaly here," he told Detective Rodriguez, pointing to his screen. "Different signature than the first site, but definitely human-made disturbance." The second excavation began immediately, despite the frozen ground and shortened daylight hours. This time, investigators knew what they were looking for, and they approached the work with grim efficiency rather than hopeful uncertainty. What they found, 4 feet beneath the surface, answered some questions while creating others that were far more disturbing. Jake Morrison's remains lay in a grave that had been dug with the same careful attention to concealment as Chloe's. But the forensic evidence painted a very different picture of his final moments. Unlike Chloe, who had been killed quickly in what appeared to be a moment of violence, Jake had died slowly. His skeleton showed signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and what Dr. Kim described as systematic physical abuse over an extended period. This young man was held captive for weeks, possibly months, before he died, she reported to the investigation team. The bone damage suggests repeated trauma, beatings, perhaps torture. He was kept alive for a significant period after his initial capture. The implications were horrifying. While Chloe had died quickly on the day they disappeared, Jake had been taken somewhere and subjected to prolonged torture before finally succumbing to his injuries or being murdered outright. But where had he been held? The extensive search efforts in the months following their disappearance had covered hundreds of square miles. How had someone managed to keep Jake captive without being detected? Analysis of Jake's remains provided additional clues that deepened the mystery. His clothes, better preserved than Chloe's due to different soil conditions, included items that hadn't been in his possession when he disappeared. A winter jacket that was several sizes too large. Boots that didn't match any brand he'd owned. Clothing that suggested he'd been moved to different locations, possibly seasonal camps or remote structures. Most disturbing of all was what investigators didn't find: Jake's camera. Jake Morrison had been passionate about photography, carrying expensive equipment that he treated with obsessive care. His camera had been worth several $1,000s, the kind of valuable item that would typically show up in pawn shops or online marketplaces if stolen. But despite extensive efforts to trace the equipment, including alerts to photography dealers across the western United States, Jake's camera never surfaced. Detective Rodriguez began developing a theory that was as complex as it was chilling. The teenagers hadn't been victims of random violence or even carefully planned murder. They'd been taken by someone who'd wanted Jake alive, someone who'd killed Chloe either to eliminate a witness or in a moment of uncontrolled violence. Jake had been kept captive, possibly moved between different locations, tortured for information or twisted pleasure, before finally being killed and buried near his girlfriend's body. But what had the perpetrator wanted? What information could Jake have possessed that was worth months of captivity and torture? What had happened to make keeping him alive more valuable than simply killing both teenagers of the scene? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit updated their profile based on the new evidence. They were now looking for someone with extensive wilderness knowledge, access to remote structures or hiding places, and the psychological makeup to sustain long-term captivity and torture. Someone organized enough to plan and conceal complex crimes, but disturbed enough to derive satisfaction from prolonged violence. Someone who might have been operating in Colorado's wilderness for years without detection. This last possibility led investigators to examine other unsolved disappearances in the region. Over the previous decade, 6 other people had vanished in Colorado's wilderness areas under circumstances that shared similarities with Chloe and Jake's case. Experienced outdoors enthusiasts who disappeared without trace, leaving behind mysterious or contradictory evidence. Had they found the burial sites of the region's most elusive serial killer? The investigation expanded into a multi-jurisdictional task force involving law enforcement agencies from 4 states. Cold cases were reopened. Missing persons files were re-examined with fresh perspectives. Families who'd given up hope began receiving phone calls from detectives asking to re-interview them about loved ones who'd vanished years earlier. But for Sarah Hartwell and Tom Morrison, the discovery of Jake's remains brought emotions more complex than simple grief or relief. Learning that Jake had suffered for months while they'd been searching for him, that he'd died slowly while they'd been hoping for his safe return, added layers of guilt and rage to their mourning. He was alive all that time, Tom Morrison said during a press conference, his voice barely controlled. While we were putting up flyers and organizing search parties, someone was torturing my son. Someone was keeping him prisoner, hurting him, and we never found him. The media coverage intensified as details of Jake's prolonged captivity emerged. True crime podcasts devoted entire series to the case. Documentary filmmakers arrived in Colorado to interview anyone connected to the investigation. The story of the teenage lovers who'd been murdered and buried in the wilderness became a national obsession. But the attention brought new challenges. Tips flooded in from across the country. Most useless, some deliberately misleading, a few potentially valuable, but requiring extensive investigation. The task force found itself overwhelmed with information that needed to be sorted, verified, and followed up. Meanwhile, the killer remained free. 8 years after Chloe Hartwell and Jake Morrison disappeared on what should have been a perfect June morning, investigators finally had answers to some of their questions. But those answers had spawned new mysteries more disturbing than the original disappearance. Detective Rodriguez stood before the evidence board in the Task Force Command Center, studying crime scene photos, forensic reports, and behavioral analysis profiles that told a story of calculated evil. Somewhere in Colorado, possibly still active, was a killer who'd proven capable of extraordinary patience, planning, and cruelty. The emerging profile was terrifying in its implications. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. The killer had specifically targeted Chloe and Jake, lured them away from their planned route, murdered Chloe quickly, but kept Jake alive for months of torture before finally killing him and burying both bodies with meticulous care to avoid detection. We're dealing with someone who views human beings as objects for his entertainment. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Marcus Chun explained to the assembled investigators. The differential treatment of the victims, quick death for the female, prolonged torture for the male, suggests specific psychological needs that drove the crimes. But Dr. Chin's analysis raised disturbing questions about the killer's motivations. Why had Jake been kept alive? What had the perpetrator gained from months of captivity and torture? Was it purely sadistic pleasure, or had there been some other purpose? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jake's journal, recovered from the pristine campsite 5 years earlier, had been analyzed multiple times without revealing significant clues. But advances in forensic document analysis allowed investigators to detect impressions left on pages by writing that had been done on sheets that were later removed. Using specialized lighting and chemical enhancement, Forensic specialists recovered traces of writing that Jake had done after his official journal entries ended, writing that had been done while he was being held captive. The recovered text was fragmentary, consisting of partial words and incomplete sentences, but it painted a horrific picture of Jake's final months. Won't tell him about the mine. Keep asking about the photographs. Showed him the ones from Bear Creek, but not. Moved me again last night, somewhere with running water. Can hear trucks on a road. Please find Chloe. He won't say what he did to her, but I know. The implications hit the investigation team like a physical blow. Jake had been tortured for information about photographs he'd taken, specifically images related to some kind of mining operation. His captor had been searching for evidence of something Jake had documented, something worth killing for. Detective Rodriguez immediately contacted environmental agencies and mining companies operating in the region. Had Jake stumbled onto illegal mining operations during his hiking expeditions? Had he inadvertently photographed evidence of environmental crimes? The answer came from an unlikely source: Jake's digital photography instructor at his high school. Jake was working on a project about environmental damage in wilderness areas, the teacher explained during an interview. He'd been documenting illegal mining operations, unauthorized logging, pollution violations, things that were happening in areas where they shouldn't be. He was planning to submit his work to environmental groups after graduation. The project had been Jake's secret. He hadn't told his parents or even Chloe about the full scope of his environmental investigation. He'd been working alone, hiking to remote locations, photographing evidence of crimes that were hidden from public view. And someone had discovered what he was doing. The investigation took on new urgency as detectives realized they were dealing with more than a simple murder case. Jake had been killed to protect illegal operations worth potentially millions of dollars. Chloe had died because she'd been with him when he was captured. Analysis of Jake's recovered photographs, stored on cloud servers and backup drives his captor had never found, revealed evidence of extensive illegal mining operations in protected wilderness areas. Strip mining in national forests, chemical contamination of streams, unauthorized road building through sensitive ecosystems. But the photographs also revealed something else. The mining operations were sophisticated, well-funded, and connected to larger criminal enterprises. This wasn't small-scale illegal mining by desperate individuals. This was organized crime using wilderness areas as cover for environmental destruction on an industrial scale. The investigation expanded once again, now involving federal environmental enforcement agencies, organized crime task forces, and financial crime specialists. Jake Morrison's murder had uncovered a criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple states and involved millions of dollars in illegal profits. But finding Jake's killer would require identifying which of the criminal organizations had discovered his photography project and decided he was too dangerous to live. The break came from analyzing the industrial plastic that had been used to wrap both bodies. Chemical analysis revealed manufacturing markers that traced the material to a specific production facility in Wyoming. Distribution records showed the plastic had been sold to construction companies, mining operations, and agricultural businesses across the Rocky Mountain region. One name appeared on multiple purchase orders: Blackstone Environmental Services, a company that claimed to provide environmental remediation for mining operations, but had been the subject of numerous regulatory complaints. When investigators examined Blackstone's operations more closely, they discovered a company with a history of environmental violations, connections to organized crime figures, and access to the remote areas where Jake had been conducting his photography project. Most significantly, Blackstone employed individuals with military and security backgrounds, people with the skills and psychological makeup to commit the crimes that had taken Chloe and Jake's lives. As the investigation closed in on specific suspects within Blackstone's organization, Detective Rodriguez found herself hoping that 8 years after 2 teenagers had disappeared into the Colorado wilderness, justice was finally within reach. But the criminal organization that had killed Chloe and Jake wasn't going to surrender without a fight. And as the investigation team would soon discover, the danger to their own lives was just beginning. The wilderness that had claimed two young lovers was about to test the resolve of everyone seeking to bring their killer to justice. 8 years after Chloe Hartwell and Jake Morrison disappeared on what should have been a perfect June morning, investigators finally had answers to some of their questions. But those answers had spawned new mysteries more disturbing than the original disappearance. Detective Rodriguez stood before the evidence board in the Task Force Command Center, studying crime scene photos, forensic reports, and behavioral analysis profiles that told a story of calculated evil. Somewhere in Colorado, possibly still active, was a killer who'd proven capable of extraordinary patience, planning, and cruelty. The emerging profile was terrifying in its implications. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. The killer had specifically targeted Chloe and Jake, lured them away from their planned route, murdered Chloe quickly, but kept Jake alive for months of torture before finally killing him and burying both bodies with meticulous care to avoid detection. We're dealing with someone who views human beings as objects for his entertainment. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Marcus Chun explained to the assembled investigators. The differential treatment of the victims, quick death for the female, prolonged torture for the male, suggests specific psychological needs that drove the crimes. But Dr. Chin's analysis raised disturbing questions about the killer's motivations. Why had Jake been kept alive? What had the perpetrator gained from months of captivity and torture? Was it purely sadistic pleasure, or had there been some other purpose? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jake's journal, recovered from the pristine campsite 5 years earlier, had been analyzed multiple times without revealing significant clues. But advances in forensic document analysis allowed investigators to detect impressions left on pages by writing that had been done on sheets that were later removed. Using specialized lighting and chemical enhancement, forensic specialists recovered traces of writing that Jake had done after his official journal entries ended, writing that had been done while he was being held captive. The recovered text was fragmentary, consisting of partial words and incomplete sentences, but it painted a horrific picture of Jake's final months. Won't tell him about the mine. Keep asking about the photographs. Showed him the ones from Bear Creek, but not. Moved me again last night. Somewhere with running water. Can hear trucks on a road. Please find Chloe. He won't say what he did to her, but I know. The implications hit the investigation team like a physical blow. Jake had been tortured for information about photographs he'd taken, specifically images related to some kind of mining operation. His captor had been searching for evidence of something Jake had documented, something worth killing for. Detective Rodriguez immediately contacted environmental agencies and mining companies operating in the region. Had Jake stumbled onto illegal mining operations during his hiking expeditions? Had he inadvertently photographed evidence of environmental crimes? The answer came from an unlikely source. Jake's digital photography instructor at his high school. Jake was working on a project about environmental damage in wilderness areas, the teacher explained during an interview. He'd been documenting illegal mining operations, unauthorized logging, pollution violations, things that were happening in areas where they shouldn't be. He was planning to submit his work to environmental groups after graduation. The project had been Jake's secret. He hadn't told his parents or even Chloe about the full scope of his environmental investigation. He'd been working alone, hiking to remote locations, photographing evidence of crimes that were hidden from public view. And someone had discovered what he was doing. The investigation took on new urgency as detectives realized they were dealing with more than a simple murder case. Jake had been killed to protect illegal operations worth potentially millions of dollars. Chloe had died because she'd been with him when he was captured. Analysis of Jake's recovered photographs, stored on cloud servers and backup drives his captor had never found, revealed evidence of extensive illegal mining operations in protected wilderness areas. Strip mining in national forests, chemical contamination of streams, unauthorized road building through sensitive ecosystems. But the photographs also revealed something else. The mining operations were sophisticated, well-funded, and connected to larger criminal enterprises. This wasn't small-scale illegal mining by desperate individuals. This was organized crime using wilderness areas as cover for environmental destruction on an industrial scale. The investigation expanded once again, now involving federal environmental enforcement agencies, organized crime task forces, and financial crime specialists. Jake Morrison's murder had uncovered a criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple states and involved millions of dollars in illegal profits. But finding Jake's killer would require identifying which of the criminal organizations had discovered his photography project and decided he was too dangerous to live. The break came from analyzing the industrial plastic that had been used to wrap both bodies. Chemical analysis revealed manufacturing markers that traced the material to a specific production facility in Wyoming. Distribution records showed the plastic had been sold to construction companies, mining operations, and agricultural businesses across the Rocky Mountain region. One name appeared on multiple purchase orders: Blackstone Environmental Services, a company that claimed to provide environmental remediation for mining operations, but had been the subject of numerous regulatory complaints. When investigators examined Blackstone's operations more closely, they discovered a company with a history of environmental violations, connections to organized crime figures, and access to the remote areas where Jake had been conducting his photography project. Most significantly, Blackstone employed individuals with military and security backgrounds, people with the skills and psychological makeup to commit the crimes that had taken Chloe and Jake's lives. As the investigation closed in on specific suspects within Blackstone's organization, Detective Rodriguez found herself hoping that 8 years after 2 teenagers had disappeared into the Colorado wilderness, justice was finally within reach. But the criminal organization that had killed Chloe and Jake wasn't going to surrender without a fight. And as the investigation team would soon discover, the danger to their own lives was just beginning. The wilderness that had claimed 2 young lovers was about to test the resolve of everyone seeking to bring their killer to justice. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the young people in your own community who might be vulnerable to predatory groups, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell us, what would you do if someone you loved vanished without a trace? How far would you go to bring them home? Subscribe for more true crime stories that matter, stories that remind us why we must never stop fighting for the missing, the lost, and the forgotten. Because sometimes, one person's refusal to give up can change everything. Thank you for listening, and remember, love is the most powerful force in the world, strong enough to reach across any distance, survive any separation, and bring even the lost souls home.